The call from the dorm room. In 2015, University of Southern California student Michael Andrews left his dorm with his roommate, Steve, to attend a frat party off campus. Midway through the Uber ride, Steve realized he had left his phone back in the dorm, but neither of them thought it was worth turning back for. At the party, the two friends separated, mingling with different groups. That was when Michael's phone rang. It was Steve's number. Through the chaotic noise of the party, Michael answered and heard Steve's voice, masked by static. The words were faint but clear enough. "Come back to the room." Then the call ended. Concerned, Michael left the party and took an Uber back to the dorm. He tried calling and texting Steve, but there was no response. When he arrived, the room was empty. But Steve's phone was sitting on his bed, untouched. Curious, Michael checked the notifications on the screen. Every missed call and text he had sent was still there, unread. An hour later, Steve finally returned to the dorm. When Michael asked why he called, Steve's face twisted in confusion. "I never called you. I never even had my phone." Michael's blood ran cold. His phone had a record of a 15-second call from Steve's number. But Steve's phone? There was no record of the call ever being made. The phone company couldn't trace it. No one else was in their dorm. No explanation was ever found. The disappearance of Donna Lass. In 1970, 25-year-old Donna Lass was a nurse at a casino first aid station in South Lake Tahoe, California. One day, her boss and her landlord received strange calls from an unidentified man. The caller claimed Donna had a family emergency and would be out of town for a while. But when Donna's boss reached out to her mother, he learned the truth. The call was a lie. Donna had vanished. Her car was found parked outside her apartment, but there was no trace of her. The last clue to her whereabouts was an unfinished entry in her logbook from the night she disappeared, as if she had been interrupted. 6 months later, the San Francisco Chronicle received a chilling postcard. It was from the infamous Zodiac killer. The note made no direct mention of Donna, but it hinted at a victim buried near Lake Tahoe, his 12th kill. The connection was obvious. Yet something didn't add up. The Zodiac was known for never hiding his victims. If he wasn't responsible, then who was? To this day, Donna Lass has never been found. The last words of Brandon Swanson. In 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home after a night out in Minnesota when his car veered off the road and crashed into a ditch. Stranded in the middle of nowhere, he called his parents for help. Brandon gave them his location, but when they arrived, his car was nowhere to be found. For over 45 minutes, his parents stayed on the phone with him as he described his surroundings. He mentioned seeing lights from a nearby town and started walking toward them. Then, without warning, Brandon's voice changed. "Oh shit." The line went dead. His parents tried calling back. No answer. Hundreds of volunteers and 30 search dogs combed the area. They found his car, but not Brandon. What did he see in those final moments? And why did he vanish into thin air? The screaming phone calls. Reddit user Stacy Kolupski once shared the terrifying ordeal of her brother, who began receiving unnerving phone calls every night around 2 to 3 a.m. Whenever he answered, he was met with a horrific sound, static mixed with distant, tortured screams. It continued for a month. Desperate, he changed his phone number. At first, the calls stopped. Then, a week later, they returned. Same time, same sound. One night, he decided to call the number back. An old man answered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Eventually, he switched phone companies entirely. The calls paused. Then, one evening, his mother played a voicemail she had received on the home phone. It was the same static, the same screams. When he backdialed the number, this time, it was disconnected. And just like that, the calls stopped forever. The l'enfant harassment. In 1983, Washington, D.C. restaurant owner Bashir Kaushiki began receiving harassing phone calls. It started as an occasional nuisance but quickly escalated to several calls a day, every day, for nearly a decade. The caller became known as l'enfant, French for the child, because he often imitated a young girl's voice. But it wasn't just Kaushiki who was targeted. His pregnant spouse, employees, and even his sister became victims of the relentless torment. One day, the harassment turned physical. Someone scratched the Star of David all over his car. Kaushiki suffered a mental breakdown and checked himself into a psychiatric ward. Even there, the calls continued. Desperate, the FBI placed a trace on the calls. What they discovered was even more terrifying. The calls weren't coming from one person. Multiple payphones across the city were being used, sometimes in rapid succession. It was a coordinated effort, but who was behind it? And why? To this day, the motive behind L'Enfant remains a mystery. The vanishing of Tanya. Jason Alexander's family frequently received calls for a woman named Tanya. It wasn't unusual. Her last name was common in their town. Over time, the calls faded, and the family forgot about her. 4 years later, Jason was driving home when he came across a gruesome accident. A car had crashed into a signage pole near his house. The driver? Tanya. Days later, the police called Jason's home. Is Tanya there? She had vanished from the crash site. Her car was there, wrecked, but she was gone without a trace. No one ever saw her again. The Phantom Message. In 1965, 22-year-old Judith Hyams disappeared from Coral Gables, Florida. Her abandoned car was found in Atlanta, blood smeared across the back seat. At the time, she was pregnant and had allegedly arranged for an illegal abortion with a Hungarian doctor, George Haidu. When Haidu skipped bail and fled the country, the case went cold. For 25 years, Judith was forgotten. Until 1990. Out of nowhere, bizarre phone calls began flooding into the Coral Gables police station. One caller claimed Judith was alive in Omaha, Nebraska. Another, who identified himself as an FBI informant, provided a phone number that traced back to Dr. Haidu. Days after the case aired on Unsolved Mysteries, a letter arrived. It claimed Judith had died during the abortion and was dumped in a watery grave. But the biggest question remains unanswered. Who sent the calls? Final thoughts. These stories share one thing in common: the phantom calls that led to more questions than answers. Some calls led to tragedy, others to vanishing acts. But one thing remains certain: not all voices on the phone belong to the living.